It was a huge empire, dominated by a Turkish dynasty that had its origins in Asia Minor. The Ottomans were defenders of Islam. In 1453, they subjugated the Byzantine Empire, whose capital, Constantinople, became Istanbul. During their heyday in the 17th century, they even laid siege to Vienna. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from the Black Sea to the Red Sea. They ruled a considerable mix of peoples and faiths. But then came the century in which the Ottoman Empire disintegrated. Its collapse can still be felt in the Balkans and the Middle East today. Its wreckage is still a major concern of modern world politics. Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The monuments to the tragic Yugoslav wars, the last conflicts of the 20th century in the heart of Europe. For more than 3 years, Sarajevo was besieged by Serb nationalists who were bent on destroying the exemplary coexistence of Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Muslim Bosnians. Bosnian civilians were the first victims of this ethnic cleansing. They too were Slavs, but descendants of people who converted to Islam when the Ottomans conquered the Balkans in the 14th century.
The wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s had reawakened a lot of cliches. So there was the idea that somehow, for some bizarre reason, in this part of Europe, maybe it was the Ottomans, who knew? People had always hated each other. And that's why things had blown up in 1991 and 1992. And if you knew about the history of Southeastern Europe, you would know this was wrong. There was no great history of ethnic tension, even though there was a history of massively complicated ethnic and confessional coexistence. So the task of the historians in the 1990s was to combat the stereotype. And in combating the stereotype, it was easy to create another stereotype, which is the Ottoman Empire had been this wonderfully peaceful place in which Jews and Christians and Muslims had sort of loved one another.
In the light of the violence and chaos that followed, the Ottoman Empire felt like a golden age, but in reality, it was marked by great social inequality. Non-Muslims were subordinate to Muslims. They had to pay a special tax, weren't allowed to carry arms, and weren't allowed to engage in missionary work. Orthodox Christians, Armenian Catholics and Jews were members of millets, a word with Arabic roots meaning religious community. Every millet had its own clergy responsible not only for religious but also for secular matters. Thanks to these millets, Christians, Jews and Muslims were able to live side by side without mixing throughout the empire, from the Balkans to Anatolia, from the Lebanese mountains to the Holy Land. It was an imperfect system, but it had its advantages. It gave the empire stability for more than 4 centuries. This order was accepted as long as the identity of the subjugated peoples was based exclusively on their religion.
The minute you start getting a political world, this system is going to break down. And that is what happens in the 19th century, and that is the great conundrum for the empire, how to adapt this system of government that sort of functioned in a pre-political world for a political world.
This new political world was based on the ideals of the French Revolution, on the people's new desire for freedom and independence. It shook the foundations of the empire. The Greeks were the first to rebel against the Ottoman shackles. Unrest began in 1821, and it soon resulted in a war of independence.
A Greek sense of identity existed before the start of the 19th century. It was based on the legacy of ancient Greece and on the Greek Orthodox religion in particular.
After the uprising in Greece, the Orthodox Christians in the empire saw themselves as one people, with a common language and history, as a Greek nation that wanted an independent state. It was an example for the other minorities in the Ottoman Empire, and one that had huge explosive power. The empire's enemies were aware of this. Under the pretext of wanting to protect Christians who were being oppressed in this Muslim empire, France, Great Britain and Russia supported the Greek separatists. They all fancied Ottoman territories, in Europe and in Asia. Greece was of strategic significance thanks to its central location on the Mediterranean, particularly for Russia, which wanted to control shipping routes in the Mediterranean Sea.
We mustn't forget that the foreign powers in the region were rivals. The interests of France, Great Britain and Russia were frequently in conflict. Two of these powers were always teaming up against the third. Greece was the location where these conflicts played out. In particular, with regard to the interests of Great Britain, the major naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the interests of Russia, which was seeking to establish itself there.
In 1829, France, Britain and Russia convened in London to negotiate Greece's independence. This independence cut a big hole in the Ottoman Empire.
At this time, the Ottoman Empire ruled the entire Middle East. It was a vast realm. The loss of continental Greece and the Peloponnese was not particularly significant from a territorial perspective, but it had a powerful symbolic effect. It triggered the rebellions that characterized the entire 19th century and would lead to the loss of the Balkans. It created a huge trauma that still resonates in Turkish history.
The spark quickly spread. Encouraged by Russia, the Serbs and Romanians rose up, achieving autonomy. They were still part of the Ottoman Empire, but they were on their way to independence. How could this tide be stopped? In 1839, Sultan Abdul-Majid initiated a hitherto unseen reform process, the Tanzimat. It promised freedom, security, and legal and fiscal equality for all Ottoman subjects, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. As if it were still possible to create an Ottoman citizen who was attached to the empire.
I don't think the imperial bureaucrats were aware of just how far-reaching the desire for emancipation was. It was the transition from a purely religious to a national identity. Every religious group became a national unit. The languages Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, Armenian, on which these faith communities were based, accelerated this nationalization process.
Little by little, the Ottoman millets were transformed into nations, nations whose foundations were religious identity and language. The Balkans remain shaped by these factors today. In Bosnia, a Slavic people sharing the same Slavic language split into opposing nations. Orthodox Christians declared themselves to be Serbs, whereupon Muslims demanded their own identity. Not Serbs or Ottomans, but Bosniaks. A rebellion broke out among Serbian peasants in rural Bosnia in 1875. It heightened the break between the peoples.
The landowning class in Bosnia tend to be Muslim. The peasants tend to be Orthodox. And so a peasant revolt can be read as a class revolt, and it can be read as an ethnic revolt. If you're a nationalist historian, you read the events of 1875 in Herzegovina as a nationalist revolt. When you read the correspondence of the time, it's both. Okay, this is a region that suffers from endemic starvation. The climate is very precarious. There's a bad harvest. Now, is that an ethnic revolt or is it not an ethnic revolt? It's both at the same time.
Christian peasants took up arms all across the Balkans. Irregular Ottoman soldiers, the Bashi Bazouks, brutally put down the revolts. They committed countless massacres in Bulgaria, reported in the Western press. Europe took the side of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The Turks were painted as being the bad side and were accused of terrible atrocities, while no mention was made of what was being done to Muslim groups in the Balkans. The situation came to a head in 1876. The Bosnian revolt had become the crisis in the East. The Ottoman power was faltering. The ruling Sultan, Abdulaziz in Istanbul, was overthrown. His successor, Murad V, was considered insane. In August 1876, his brother Abdul Hamid II came to power. He received the Sword of Osman, the founder of the dynasty, in the Eyüp Sultan Mosque. He was 34 years old when he became the 34th Ottoman Sultan.
Sultan Abdul Hamid was the last stand. When the empire started crumbling as a result of the nationalist efforts, particularly in the Balkans, and under the pressure of the major powers, he tried playing a new card. He was seen as a liberal who would give the empire a constitution. This dream had been there for several years. The liberal Ottomans believed that this would solve all the empire's problems. They trusted he'd be able to prevent an intervention by the major powers.
Abdul Hamid made the liberals' dream come true. There was to be a constitution, elections, a parliament. The equality of all subjects, of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, was left untouched. Did he believe he could stem the nationalist tide in the Balkans and the call of the European powers for reforms this way? His illusions were short-lived. In April 1877, Russia declared war.
The big problem of the Ottoman Empire was Russia, which wanted to break it apart. Russia saw itself as a protector of the Slavs, particularly the Balkan ones. There was a sizable pan-Slavic movement that had a big influence on the Russian leadership. Dostoevsky, for example, dreamed of Constantinople being conquered so it could become Tsargrad, the city of Tsars. It was a major confrontation. Christianity versus Islam, and Pan-Slavism versus the Ottoman Empire. A lot was at stake.
The Turks were defeated in just a few weeks. Russia planned to break up the empire, but neither France, nor Britain, nor Austro-Hungary wanted to allow Russia to get all the spoils for itself. In June 1878, the major European powers convened at a congress in Berlin. The Ottomans were represented too, as observers. They were allowed no say in the negotiations. The big haggle began. As the victorious power, Russia claimed territories in the Caucasus. It achieved the formation of a new Christian state, Bulgaria. It was officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, Russia had the say there. Romania, Montenegro, and Serbia finally achieved independence. Bosnia-Herzegovina was Austro-Hungary's counterweight to the Russian influence in the Balkans. Abdul Hamid's empire lost more than 200,000 square kilometers in Europe.
The real story of the whole epoch, it's not only the story of the loss of Ottoman territory, but it's therefore the story of the loss of homes of Ottoman Muslims. And it's the story of the displacement of millions of people, and often very, very violent displacement. And when do people start thinking about refugees as an international problem? And what we can see is that the crisis of 1876 to 78, maybe together with the early expansion of the Russian Empire around the Black Sea, which had also created hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees, this is the beginning of the modern age of the refugee.
After the war and the humiliation in Berlin, Abdul Hamid's liberal intermezzo was over. He got rid of the constitution of 1876 and now ruled alone as a despot, albeit an enlightened one. Sultan Abdul Hamid still wanted to save the empire. He wanted to add the achievements of the West to Oriental civilization, he said. Under his reign, the army and administration, the judicial system, trade and infrastructure were all modernized. Education was prioritized. Military academies and medical and legal faculties were established throughout the empire. In 1888, passengers enjoyed their first journey on the Orient Express, Istanbul to Paris in just 3 days. Travellers flooded in, and with them their Western fashions and influences.
Istanbul, Constantinople, was a magical and, in the second half of the 19th century, a completely modern city. Abdul Hamid's reign was, despite oppression and autocracy, a belle époque for the people of Istanbul. You can see that around the Pera Palace Hotel. Sarah Bernhardt stayed there a couple of times. A new social class formed. A middle class dressed in suits and ties as a product of this modernity. It comprised all those who were benefiting from the survival of the empire.
The Europeans were also interested in the continued existence of the Ottoman Empire. France and Great Britain in particular had invested in trade, in railway companies and in mines. A kind of central bank was established when the Imperial Ottoman Bank was set up with French and British capital. A leading position that was further enhanced by the capitulation system. Treaties dating from the 16th century that gave the Europeans significant privileges, such as the freedom to trade and tax exemptions in the Ottoman Empire.
In the 19th century, these special rights were granted to all Western powers, which made them untouchable. It was a comprehensive charter which gave all foreign nationals the right to trade freely without informing the Ottoman authorities, thanks to the capitulations. They enjoyed immunity and extraterritoriality, almost a colonial privilege, in fact.
These capitulations are a violation of our rights, wrote Sultan Abdul Hamid. But what could he do? His scope for action was limited. When he came to power, the state was bankrupt and unable to service its debts on the French and British markets. In 1881, his power was further curtailed by the formation of a special administration for state debts.
This consortium had the right to lay its hands on all state income, as was necessary to keep the empire solvent and to guarantee the repayment of debts. That was an encroachment on the empire's fiscal sovereignty. There was a lot of complaining and bitterness. The bottom line was that the Orient wasn't able to modernize following the Western example without outside stimulus. This resulted in an inferiority complex that's still tangible in Turkey today. This curious mix of love and hate for the West. We love it. We want to be like it, to get rid of our own societal model.
For a long time, France and Britain were the guarantors of stability in the Ottoman Empire. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, their priorities changed. European imperialism had reached its climax. It needed new resources and new markets. After conquering Ottoman Algeria, France invaded Tunisia in 1881. The following year, Great Britain occupied Egypt. The Suez Canal brought it closer to its colonial empire in India. The Ottomans saw it as a betrayal, but for one power that had hitherto stood on the sidelines, it was an opportunity to join the conversation. In 1889, Kaiser Wilhelm II went to Istanbul for a state visit, where he was received with great pomp and circumstance by Sultan Abdul Hamid. As a symbol of their new friendship, the two rulers hatched plans for a new railway line. It was to run from Berlin to Baghdad, to Mesopotamia, to the Persian Gulf and its oil fields, on the doorstep of the British area of influence. Kaiser later engaged in further symbolic actions during a trip to the Holy Land. In Damascus, he officially declared himself a friend and protector of the Muslim peoples.
The Germans knew how to benefit from the fact that they were new on this stage as a power that had never acted against Ottoman interests before. They had never participated in the exploitation of Ottoman resources. In fact, and this is often forgotten, they came out in favor of Muslims.
A clever political move at a time when Sultan Abdul Hamid was putting Islam center stage, politically and strategically.
The Ottomans are very concerned that the experience of the Balkans, the development of a distinct national identity based around religion, history, not be replicated in the Arab world. Balkanization meant the partition and the secession of whole territories on which the Ottoman Empire depended as a global strength. Were the same forces to be unleashed in the Arab world, then the Ottomans would be reduced to the lands of the Turks, and they wished to fight that at all costs.
Abdul Hamid knew that the empire could lose the Balkans sooner or later, whereupon the retreat to Asia Minor, barely more than Anatolia, would have been unavoidable. And that's why it was important to protect the hard core, the Turkish core, of the empire from the Muslim periphery. Who could that be? The Albanians, the Kurds, and the Arabs.
Abdul Hamid was not just a worldly leader, he was also a caliph, a spiritual leader of the Sunni faithful. This honor went back to the 16th century when the holy sites of Mecca and Medina were conquered by the Ottomans. Abdul Hamid was to use this role to make Islam the new foundation of his empire, a realm with a new direction, whose population was now 3/4 Muslim. In 1900, in honor of his anniversary in office, Abdul Hamid began with the construction of the Hejaz Railway from Istanbul to Mecca. It portrayed the Ottomans as the guardians of pilgrimage, transcending their imperial borders. The Caliph's policies largely played out within the Ottoman Empire. Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Hejaz, Yemen, the Sultan's attention had returned to the long-neglected Arab provinces. The railway brought them closer to the centre of the empire. Schools and academies were opened. The local elites were encouraged and incorporated into the army and administration. Even though calls for autonomy and cultural renewal were making themselves heard in Beirut and Damascus, the Arab provinces remained loyal to the empire. In eastern Anatolia, meanwhile, one Christian minority was pursuing nationalist goals, the Armenians. Scattered across the Ottoman, Russian and Persian empires, they focused on their religion, their language and their ancient history. The Ottomans saw it as a threat at the heart of what they viewed as the core of their identity: Anatolian, Turkish, Muslim. A rebellion broke out in Sasson in 1894. The Armenian population was massacred in retribution. It was a prelude to the genocide of 1915.
This massacre marked a caesura in the empire's history. Not just that of the 19th century, but overall. It was suddenly legitimate to massacre a population with impunity. I think the idea of ethnic homogenization was already in people's heads. There's a clear indicator of that. 200,000 victims from a population of 500,000 wasn't exactly trivial. The state wanted to move the demographic lines and at the same time shape the collective Armenian memory in a traumatic manner, to preempt further protests and demands.
Europe was outraged. Caricatures in the press nicknamed Abdul Hamid the Red Sultan, a bloodthirsty butcher. But European governments didn't get involved. The Armenians, who had officially been under their protection since the Berlin Congress, were left to their fate. The empire reoriented itself towards Anatolia and Asia Minor. In the Balkans, meanwhile, its collapse was fast approaching. Serbian, Greek and Bulgarian nationalists clashed in its last European territory, in Macedonia.
Greek nationalism had expansionist goals towards Macedonia. Images of the ancient Macedonia of King Philip and Alexander the Great were constantly evoked. That was a part of Greek nationalism right from the start. The Bulgarian nationalist movement also gained in strength in the second half of the 19th century. It too laid claim to Macedonia, while Serbian nationalists demanded part of northern Macedonia. Then there were local movements. They all behaved as if the Ottoman Empire didn't exist. Curiously, the different Christian nationalist movements fought more brutally against each other than against the ruling Ottoman Empire.
It's a process, is the first thing to say. It's not like everybody suddenly discovers they were Greek or Bulgarian or Turkish all along. So they want to prove that the Orthodox Christians of Macedonia are Greek or that they are Bulgarian. And that is a struggle that takes a long time. It takes decades, and it's fought out in schools and in churches and in the press. By 1905, 1906, it's become very, very violent. And a lot of this is a Greco-Bulgarian war that is taking place under the eyes of the Ottoman officials. Now then, at that point, of course, there is another question that emerges, which is the question of, are Muslims simply Muslims, or do they have a national allegiance?
The answer comes from the ranks of the Ottoman army. On the 3rd of July 1908, a group of young officers mutinied in Thessaloniki. Like all the Ottoman troops, they were Muslim. They were members of the Committee of Union and Progress, the largest opposition to the Sultan. They proclaimed their Turkish identity. Humiliated by the defeats and the successive retreat of the empire, they wanted to put an end to Abdul Hamid's authoritarian regime and save the empire. Calling themselves the Young Turks. Within 3 weeks, they'd set the Balkans on fire. The Sultan was under pressure to act. On the 23rd of July, Abdul Hamid had to reinstate the liberal constitution of 1876, which he had set aside in 1878. The mood was euphoric, a hitherto unknown feeling of freedom and fraternity. In a famous speech, Enver Pasha, one of the revolutionary leaders, said, "We're all brothers. There are no Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbs, Romanians or Jews in our empire. We're proud to be Ottomans."
The paradoxical aspect of this Young Turk movement was that it emerged to save the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, it gave all those rebellious forces in the empire more of a voice. The Young Turks quickly recognized this paradox. And that's why they initially said, "We're going to preserve the Ottoman Empire and will respect the demands of the non-Muslims. But the Turkish element has to be dominant in the empire." The patriotic Young Turks gradually became nationalist Turks.
The nationalist wave that had been triggered a century earlier in Greece had finally arrived in the hard Turkish core of the Ottoman Empire. It was close to the end. In the ensuing chaos, Bulgaria, egged on by Russia, declared its independence. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Ottomans were defeated. The Balkans were just waiting for a sign to turn against the Porte completely. It came from Libyan Tripolitania. Italy had set its sights on this last Ottoman province on the African continent. Rome took the offensive in September 1911. The Ottoman army resisted but was unable to halt the Italian advance. The occupation of Libya revealed the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. This encouraged Serbia, Montenegro, Greece and Bulgaria to form the Balkan League. In October 1912, they declared war on the empire. Albanian mercenaries joined them. The Ottoman army, already weakened from Libya, was destroyed. Thessaloniki, the city of the 1908 revolution, was occupied by Greek troops.
It was seen as a humiliation that this city fell without resistance because the Ottoman army was too weak. It was a double humiliation that this was repeated at Edirne, not far from Istanbul.
The Balkan nations had defeated the Ottoman Empire. But what was to become of Ottoman Macedonia? Bulgaria had different ambitions from Greece and Serbia, and they were all against the Albanians. A new war broke out, this time between the parties that had only recently been allies. It was no longer a war of liberation by the people against their oppressors. Now it was a war between nations. They all fought for themselves and were prepared to destroy all the others, all those who spoke a different language or had a different faith. Entire villages were massacred. People were displaced, raped and forcibly converted. Areas were to be cleansed with all means possible. More than 400,000 people were forcibly moved, most of them Muslims.
It means the beginning of what we would call ethnic cleansing. What I think that you have in the 1990s is an example of something that starts in the late 19th century and explodes in the early 20th. And that is the way in which weak states deploy violence against ethnic populations, either through their own soldiers or more usually through paramilitary units with which they have a close but indirect relationship. And these paramilitary units, they then outsource a kind of political violence in order to engineer some new facts on the ground. And that relationship between the state and the paramilitaries in a sense, for a nationalist goal, that goes back early. That goes back to the Balkan Wars.
The drawing of the borders fueled brutal behaviour, and a 1913 peace treaty sparked off another round of conflicts. An independent Albania was created, but its borders were disputed. Kosovo, the site of the Albanian rebellion, was given to Serbia. It was a victory steeped in symbolism. The Serbs saw this as compensation for their humiliation at the hands of the Ottomans at the Battle of the Kosovo Field in 1389. The Ottomans' victory had come to symbolize their rule over the Balkans. In 1989, Slobodan Milosevic, Yugoslavia's Serbian president, evoked a new Serbian nationalism on the 600th anniversary of this battle. It was the start of the wars that would tear former Yugoslavia apart. The last took place in Kosovo in 1998. A war aimed at driving the Albanians out of territory claimed by Serbia for once and for all. In 2003, Kosovo became the last state to have been created in Europe. The history of the Ottoman Empire in Europe had ended in 1913. The rest of its story was to be played out in the Middle East, and the impending First World War would accelerate its end.